I'd like to talk for a few minutes about this extraordinary woman named Wilma Dykeman. She does happen to be my mother, but that is not her major claim to fame. She's got some major claims to fame that we'll get to during the presentation. She was a pathfinder, a groundbreaker, years and decades before her time. I think that's why she's not globally known. She should be internationally known, but rather than even nationally known, she's more regionally known. So I'm sure this audience is a hybrid between what we call transplants and natives, and we will see that Wilma Dykeman herself was both a transplant and a native. These three pictures are from 3 stages in her career. This seems like an intelligent audience, and I'll let you guess which is early, middle, and late. Yeah. Wilma was a hybrid between folks who've moved into the southern mountains, which is obviously paradise, and folks who were native to the southern mountains. On her mother's side, she was a native. Her mother was descendant from the pioneers of the area. Her grandfather on her mother's side was a fellow named William Alfred Cole. He was a timberman. His brother was a sheriff of Madison County. You don't get more native than being sheriff of Madison County. He supervised the last public hanging in Madison County, in Marshall. Wilma's grandmother on her mother's side, her mother's father, was a fellow named John Henry Ballard, and he is still a famous, well-known preacher from the Reems Creek area. If you've gone up to the Blue Ridge Parkway via Ox Creek, you've gone through Ballard territory, and you may have even passed a sign to the Ballard Cemetery. Well, the main grave there is John Henry Ballard's grave. He was 16 when the Civil War broke out, and he and his father were fierce loyalists, which meant they did not believe in secession. And what a lot of loyalists from western North Carolina did was escape across the state line into Tennessee and across East Tennessee, very dangerous territory, ridge and valleys controlled by the Confederates, and made it to southern Kentucky to Camp Dick Robinson and joined the Union Army. Very, very astute. Well, he wasn't really a soldier, John Henry. He was more of a preacher, and after the Civil War, you might go back one slide. After the Civil War, he became a pretty well-known Free Will Baptist preacher. Free will being believed in baptism when you were when you were old enough to freely and of your own volition be baptized. Big controversy back in the 1800s. But he had two churches. One was the Union Valley Free Will Baptist Church on Ox Creek. It's still standing, and you can still see it on the right-hand side of Ox Creek as you drive up toward the Blue Ridge Parkway. And now you know why it's called Union Valley. And Wilma's father was a transplant. How many here have come into the Asheville area from somewhere else? Almost everybody. Is anybody a native? No, it's unbelievable. I was born right here at St. Joseph's Hospital. It's now called the St. Joseph's Campus of Mission Hospital. But back then it was St. Joseph's, St. Joe's. Anyway, Wilma is half like you folks, half transplant. Her father was a fellow named Willard Drome Dykeman. He was a dairy farmer from Putnam County, New York, about 50 miles north of Times Square, near towns like Carmel and Brewster. Anybody here from New York? There you go.
State, not city.
State, right. Well, he was not from the city either. He was what they call upstate. When he was 17, as teenagers do, he just wanted to do something. He read a book called The Great South, and in that book, they had pictures and illustrations of the Asheville area. So he got real excited. He came down to the Asheville area for the summer and herded sheep on Elk Mountain. Now, if you've been on top of Elk Mountain, there's a little place there where there's a saddle in the mountain, and it's kind of open space, kind of like a farm. That's where he herded sheep. So he went back, just one summer here, he went back and raised a family. Married, had a son, had a daughter, But his wife died of tuberculosis. So what sometimes happens, people say, I'm going to make a change. He said, my son's grown, my daughter's grown, my wife's now gone. And he remembered Elk Mountain. And he came back to the area and he met a 20-year-old girl named Bonnie Cole. My grandmother knew her well. And they got married, 57 and 20. That's not just winter, spring. That's December, early March. And Wilma was their only child, and she was born May 20th, 1920. Grew up at the head of Beaver Dam Creek in North Asheville. Actually, near the head of Beaver Dam Creek, the road forks, the Beaver Dam Road forks. The right-hand fork is Webb Cove, goes up to Blue Ridge Parkway. The left-hand fork is Lynn Cove, and that's where she was born, on Lynn Cove. About 12 acres there, bordering Beaver Dam Creek, with a little frog pond and woodland in back, and they had a little bungalow there. And her first words were not just one word, but 3 words: water coming down. Her friends really were, as an only child, her friends were plants, animals, water, natural features. She grew on that 10, 12 acres into environmental consciousness. She went to Grace School. It's now called Ira B. Jones Elementary School. And her parents would talk to her about the water cycle. It took me 10 seconds to download this from the internet, but back in 1926, 27, when she was 6, 7 years old, nobody was talking about the water cycle except her parents. So her parents would take her down to the creek and say, "Wilma, do you see the water flowing over that flat rock?" She'd say, "Yes." And her mother would say, "Well, I'll tell you what, that water is going to go down to the new Beaver Lake, new subdivision. It's going to go through Beaver Lake to the French Broad River. The French Broad is going to flow across the state line to Tennessee, and just outside of Knoxville, it's going to join up with the Holston, become the Great Tennessee River, which is going to go into the Ohio, the Mississippi, and it's going to come out at the Gulf of Mexico." And then her father would come in and say, "But it doesn't end there, Wilma, because some of that water is going to get evaporated into clouds. Some of those clouds are going to come right back over Craven Gap up here in Rice Knob, and it's going to let some of that rain out, some of that water out in the form of rain, and come back in 2 weeks, Wilma, and you will see the same water that you're looking at now." So her eyes would be as big as saucers. But also, those of you from outside, anybody here from Illinois, from the Chicago area? If something happens in Chicago, does that kind of pique your interest? Or are you through with Chicago? He's through with Chicago. She's not through with Chicago. Some people are not. Some people want a little connection. My grandfather wanted that connection. He subscribed to the New York Herald Tribune, and they had a little ritual. At that time, the newspaper was carrying the children's stories of a guy named Thornton Burgess, who was children's literature god back then. I mean, he sold millions of copies worldwide. He did not invent Peter Rabbit. There in the background of the picture, Beatrix Potter invented Peter Rabbit, but he ran with Peter Rabbit. And his columns would be all about Peter Rabbit and Reddy Fox, R-E-D-D-Y. Reddy Fox is in the foreground. I don't know why he has a cane, but he's got a cane. And the plot of each column would be some newfangled scheme that Reddy Fox had thought up to catch Peter Rabbit, and he would almost get him, but not quite. So you'd have to wait to the next column to see what happened. So does that remind you of anything?
Me.
Roadrunner. There you go. Good, we've got another joker in the audience. I don't like to be alone. I'm convinced that Chuck Jones, the creator of Roadrunner, stole full package, these plots from Thornton Burgess and translated them into TV, into the wildly popular Roadrunner. But Wilma and her dad had this ritual where he would go to the mailbox, he would bring back the paper, he would cut out the column, she would paste it in the scrapbooks. We still have the scrapbooks. And you see what she wrote in the scrapbook. But it was things like this that brought nature alive to her. Nature was not just something out there. Nature was peopled. So they would walk out back behind the bungalow, maybe in winter, and her dad would say, "Wilma, I wonder if Peter Rabbit made these tracks," or "I wonder where Reddy Fox is spending the winter. Is it around the curve in the Milligan's Hollow, or is it in this dead tree, the trunk of this dead tree?" So, I mean, that was how immediate nature was to her. Two bad things happened. 1929, she's 9 years old. Her dad had sold a house, nice house in Brewster, North Carolina, which is now a commuter rail stop for New York City. So he got a nice little nest egg there, and they put it away, socked it away in 2 Asheville banks. Well, 3 of 4 Asheville banks went bust, and those 2 were 2 of the 3. So she lost her nest egg. She lost her college savings. Also in 1934, you remember the winter-spring marriage? Well, it was a little too much winter-spring. So the chickens came home to roost, and when Wilma was 14, 2 weeks after this lower right-hand picture was taken, this fellow who looks like her grandfather but is really her father passed away with a heart attack. So that left 2 women, 14-year-old and 37-year-old, to face the world in the depth of the Depression. The Social Security legislation was wending its way through Congress, so not much of a safety net. So there was not too many days went by that they didn't think about food, and meals. 3 good things happened. Wilma graduated first in her class from Grace, and you remember her first word was 3 words, so she was talkative. We loved to hear her talk. She would just fill up the spaces with talk. Here's what happened. She had more energy than anybody I've ever seen. And I've seen a lot of people now. She had gotten it in her head that she wanted to be an actress. You remember that picture from early in her life? That's her actress picture. That's her budding actress picture. And she also got it in her head that she wanted to go to a place called Northwestern, the Northwestern University School of Speech. That's what they called acting schools back then. So after high school graduation, her friends were going to places like Chapel Hill and Boone and Cullowhee and even Mars Hill, and Wilma wasn't going anywhere. She was going to this little college, Asheville Biltmore College, that would later become UNCA, but back then it was a 2-year college. And they would say, "Wilma, with all your talent, why are you not going somewhere else, seeing the world?" She said, "I got a plan. My plan is I'm going to save money, room and board. I'll be at the house on Lynn Cove. I'm going to work at Cress's, earn a little pocket money, and I'm going to try to get a scholarship to Northwestern University." And lo and behold, she did win a scholarship. Her plan was successful. And she studied with a great acting teacher, Alvina Krause, almost as famous as the Strasbergs. Alvina Krause taught Charlton Heston, Jennifer Jones, Patricia Neal, Richard Benjamin, Paula Prentice, a lot of folks over many generations. And she told Wilma, she said, "You're going to be a star." It's a declarative sentence. She said, "Trust me, I know, many have come through, and you will be a star. It's just a question of when." So Wilma lined up a job in Manhattan, and it wasn't even waiting tables. Miss Finch's Junior College had come through to interview on campus, and they were beginning a broadcasting department, and they hired her to be the broadcasting teacher. So Wilma, the odds would have been high that Wilma would have been a success in New York, either as an actress or as a broadcaster. She had a great voice. But something happened. She met my dad. She came back to the house on Lynn Cove for the summer, and Mabel Wolfe Wheaton, Thomas Wolfe's daughter, suggested to my dad, who was living just across the state line in Tennessee, that he ought to come up and meet this brilliant graduate of Northwestern University. And he did, and they met about, do the math, there's some mathematicians here. They met August 15th, and they were married October 12th. Try that one. They were a great match in a lot of ways. Each was the love of the other's life. They began their married life in the 1940s. They grew apples. They built a little stone cottage in the mountains. And they tried to write. My dad concentrated on poetry. My mother concentrated on fiction, short stories, novels. But then an idea occurred to them. And that idea was, look, there's this famous series of books out there called the Rivers of America series. There have been 30 or 30 plus books published as part of this series. It's really the big league, publishing. And the idea that Reinhardt Publishing in New York had was, we'll get a good writer to write about the history and culture of a river, and we'll just do a series on all the rivers or all the major rivers in the U.S. So Mother sent a chapter up called On the Hog Groves, the great hog groves of the 19th century through the French Broad River Gorge, and people up in New York City had never heard of anything like this, really original. They said, we want to see more. She sent them a full manuscript. There was a problem with the full manuscript. Go ahead. This was not one of the problems. When they did publish the book, they had driven everywhere in the watershed. They had driven up all the dirt roads and down all the dirt roads. They'd talked with the old timers, and they elevated oral history almost on a par with documentary history. Back then, if you didn't just read old dusty papers that were about to fall apart in your hands, you were not a historian. And oral history was just nothing. But they really privileged oral history and brought it really into its own, and devoted a lot of pages of the French Broad to the stories that these old timers had to tell. But the real problem was water pollution. One chapter that Mother had included, that Wilma Dykeman had included in that manuscript, was about water pollution in the French Broad River. Now put yourselves in the shoes of the editor of Reinhardt Publishing in New York City. Do you really want your cash cow, your cash machine, now for the first time in the history of this series, the 40th volume of the series, to really talk about water pollution, how this river is really polluted? Never happened before. And the editor said, no. Do your Roadrunner sound again? That's it. That's what the editor said. Took a big red pencil through it and said, well, tell you what, Wilma, you make this chapter vanish and we will publish this book. So anybody here ever want to be a writer? Ever want to publish a book? They really wanted to do that. Mother could not. She had traded Broadway for Asheville. Not Asheville of today, Asheville of 1950, 55. Not much going on. So she was trying to do what she could with what she had. So this was her gateway into the big leagues. Some people would probably have said, okay, I can live with that, and rationalized it, said, well, maybe I will come well enough known that I can do it later. Well, Mother said no. She said, it's got to be in there. We wouldn't be true to the French Broad if we didn't put it in there. And she said, I will compromise to the extent that I will title this chapter, Who Killed the French Broad? That's kind of funny. The French Broad. So publisher didn't want it. Wilma fought for it, made a mystery out of it. Who killed the French Broad? And there was a bad actor in town, a bad single point polluter in town, or in the area, called Champion Paper and Fiber Company. And they were basically the biggest employer in Western North Carolina, by far the biggest employer in Canton, North Carolina, just to the west of us. Very politically powerful in Western North Carolina, and it would have been very easy for Wilma to say, look, we got a problem. We got this bad actor, and we've got to clean it. If they clean up their act, then everything will be fine. Well, she was astute enough to know that the fact that Champion Fiber was routing the French Broad's major tributary through its plant, and when it went in, it was pristine, and when it came out, it was black, lemon meringue topping, and a ton of dioxins. She was astute enough to know that that's not just a Champion problem, that's everybody's problem. So basically she said, if we let it happen, we are part of the problem. And she called for a law saying the killing of the French Broad must cease. And that law became the Clean Water Act of 1972. Still our most powerful weapon against water pollution. Hate to say it, we should have more powerful tools, but Congress and the President haven't gotten around to making that happen. But Wilma's big idea was this argument stands economically. It's an economic argument. This is not just an altruistic argument. We don't even know what's good, which side our bread is buttered on. And her economic argument relied on three legs of the tripod. First leg was clean water is going to attract more tourists, more fishermen, more nature lovers, more hunters. Second argument, it's going to attract more new industry for two reasons. Some industries may want clean water, but every plant will have executives who have to live here with families, and what will attract them to the area. So does this kind of make you think of anything? Duke, make you think of any maybe new industries in the Asheville area?
Beer. Yeah.
You know, so 2015 it's happening, 60 years after the publication of the French Broad. And we haven't even gotten to the third one yet, drinking water from municipalities. It is true that 1 million to 2 million people currently drink their water from the French Broad, but take a look at what's happening in California, what's happening in the far west, what's happening even in the Midwest. We are probably the richest water area in the country at this point. 10 major rivers flowing both east and west rise in western North Carolina. What are we going to do with that? 50 years ago, we had the world's greatest virgin hardwood forest. Let it go. Sold it for a pittance. Nothing remains except a few little acres down at Joyce Kilmer Memorial Forest. What are we going to do with our water? Think about it. French Broad became a big success, and the most talked about chapter nationally was Who Killed the French Broad? So Mother fought for it and actually did Reinhardt some good. But on the strength of the French Broad and what my parents had done researching that, they said, we're going to do the same thing for the South with regard to race relations. You couldn't grow up in the South in the late 50s. 2 years after 1955, the Supreme Court decision, Brown versus Board of Education, forcing integration of the schools. Everybody in the South had a view one way or another, and all points in between. So my parents went from Charleston to Houston, interviewing people, including Medgar Evers and other gods of the civil rights movement, and wrote this book, won a national award. And on the strength of that, the New York Times picked them up as the people in country. You know how journalists, if you send a journalist over to Vietnam, that person is suddenly in country. Well, a lot of Northerners thought of the South as another country, and they said, "Oh, we got two people who seem to be intelligent already living there." So they hired them to write periodic articles for the New York Times Magazine, and these articles would not be who sat at what lunch counter yesterday, who marched where yesterday. It would be more sort of, let's step back over a 3-month time period and figure out what's gone on and where we are in this whole campaign. Are we making progress? Are we not making progress? And they wrote those kinds of pieces for a number of magazines, and their article on the Montgomery bus boycott, Montgomery Morning, was selected by the Library of American series on reporting civil rights. At about the same time, Wilma got mad. She just got mad. Anybody here ever get mad? So it's one thing to get mad at somebody you love and, for no good reason. That's not a good mad. A good mad is a mad about something that ought to be changed, something that would make mankind better. And Mother had just had enough of the stereotypes of the people living in the southern mountains. The first great wave of stereotyping had been in the late 1800s, at exactly the same time that the coal and the timber was being exploited. The local colorists were stereotyping the mountains, saying this is just a bunch of barbarians down here. And what really would help would be for us, people outside the mountains, to come and civilize them. So these things worked hand in hand. The stereotyping sort of rationalized, gave a reason for coal barons and timber barons to come down and rape the mountains. So we're actually helping. We're actually helping these people. We're bringing them into civilization. So that was the first wave. But the second wave was worse. The second wave started in the Depression. Everybody was hurting, but something about human nature. People like to look down on other people. So through the comic strips, daily reinforcement, you had these two unbelievable comic strips, Little Abner and Snuffy Smith. And they just reminded people that, hey, I may have it bad. I may be worrying about where supper's coming from, but at least I am not a savage. At least I don't live somewhere called North Carolina, Tennessee, Kentucky. So Mother said, look, I'm going to write a book, and it's going to have a mountaineer as a hero. And then she thought about it some more, and she said, well, that hero's going to be a heroine. And she wrote The Tall Woman, and the heroine was Lydia McQueen, about the time of the Civil War and afterward. And that book has never gone out of print. It sold about 250,000 copies. I remember seeing her on the Today Show back in '62. And then she followed it up with a sequel called The Far Family, bringing that family into the 20th century and reminding people that, hey, these southern mountains are not isolated from everything. There's a lot of give and take going in and going out with the rest of the world. 3 reviewers, just out of many. Baltimore Sun praised Lydia McQueen and The Tall Woman. Lillian Smith, who was a civil rights and gender groundbreaker in her own right, wrote about The Far Family that Clay Thurston is one of the most complex, interesting characters in contemporary fiction. She modeled Clay Thurston on her own uncle, Uncle Andrew Cole. I knew Andrew. He had a little problem with the bottle. And Carl Sandburg, whom they knew, he had retired down here. He just said, Jesus, she can write. She continued to pioneer. She was a pioneer. She published, her last published novel was called Return the Innocent Earth, and it was about genetically modified crops. It's a story of a cannery that begins in the mountains and grows into a Fortune 500 business with a headquarters in the Midwest. And the plot is that this cannery has invented a spray that will hold vegetables at their peak of ripeness for several weeks. I mean, can you imagine the economic impact of that? You don't have to pay overtime. You can take your time. You can get everything harvested. You can get it all in the cans. Problem is that a mountain couple has gleaned one of the Brussels sprouts fields, and the wife, Perlina Smelser, has died. So the CEO up in this Midwestern city tells his assistant, who grew up in the area, you go down there and I don't care what you do, put a lid on it. Just make it go away. So the assistant gets down there and he basically undergoes a crisis of confidence. He says, what am I doing down here? And he remembers his own growing up. And this was Mother's favorite book. She says she put everything she could into it. She followed that up with a book in support of worldwide birth control. She never shied away from a fight. She picked a few fights. And she served more than 20 years as Tennessee's first female state historian, appointed by Lamar Alexander. She lived about half her life in East Tennessee, just across the state line, in one of the poorest counties in the state, Cott County, and about half her life here in Buncombe County. And she died in 2006 at the Kiever Solace Center on Sweeten Creek Road. Later in life, She was an excellent teacher. She taught for many years at the University of Tennessee. She was a pioneer in Appalachian studies, taught many workshops. She was a world-class speaker. Remember her act? She wanted to be an actor. Remember her actress training? You just couldn't believe her posture and the way she commanded the stage. And she basically, any public speaking, she just had the whole thing in her palm of her hand without saying a word. She was a tremendous role model for young women of the area in the latter half of the 20th century. People in Tennessee wanted her to run for senator, wanted her to be a senator. You'd be a good senator, Wilma. She said, well, don't you want to know whether I'm a Republican or a Democrat? They said, we just want to hear you talk. I think one of her greatest skills, she fashioned a rich and integral life with what she had. Some of you may have come into the Asheville area, reinventing yourselves, reinventing your lives for whatever reason. And basically, Wilma did that a couple times in her life. And this was one of her favorite quotes: true joy in life, being used for a purpose recognized by yourself as a mighty one, instead of being a feverish, selfish little clod of ailments and grievances, complaining that the world will not devote itself to making you happy. I wish I had $1 for every time she said that, or part of that, to my brother and me. You can get an idea of her parenting style. Tough love doesn't begin to describe it. She was great. She was wonderful. I just want to end with a few words about a little nonprofit we've started called the Wilma Dykeman Legacy. Karen's on the board. And what we wanted to do, starting here in the Asheville area, is to sustain Wilma's core values. She would not have liked a little society that was just oriented to honoring Wilma Dykeman. She had values. Her core values were a number of things. We want to honor that legacy by co-sponsoring events and programs that reflect her core values. And the next slide is a whole bunch of them, but it boils down to 3: environmental integrity, social justice, with emphasis on African Americans and Southern mountaineers, and the power of the written and spoken word. She was a big believer in communication. People can change. And if people hear something or read something, people can change. She was a big believer in the future and a big optimist. Any funds that you might donate we've got brochures somewhere about becoming a friend of Wilma Dykeman. Wilma would have, she defined her friends emotionally, like most of you all, I'm sure. At the Legacy, we define her friends financially. And there are ways that you can become a closer friend with Wilma. Somebody sent some money, and I sent them back. I replied to him, I said, you are now, congratulations, you are now tied for Wilma's 15th closest friend. But we're a virtual organization. We don't own any real estate. We don't have to worry about fixing gutters and repairing drywall. We also don't have any paid employees. So everything that we do is oriented to paying people honoraria for helping put on programs. We partner with existing organizations, and we hope maybe you would consider becoming a friend. But this kind of draws to a close my remarks on what I consider to be an extraordinary woman, in no way because she's my mom, but just because of who she was. Wilma Dykeman. Thank you so much.